Yeah. Okay. guide the city's environmental agenda going into the future. So these are three excellent panelists, and I'm just going to say a few things to sort of frame the issues, and then they're going to each give a short talk, and then we'll have some conversation, and then we'll open it up to questions from all of you. So we all know that our oceans are in trouble, and despite Ayana's great a lot of reason to be optimistic, we do have things that we need to worry about. And one of the main reasons that oceans are in trouble is because of what's happening along our coasts. When I worked at NOAA, my boss then, Dr. Jane Lubchenco, used to talk about the land-sea connection all the time, and how the coastal areas are sort of the connective tissue between what happens on land and what happens in the ocean. And both the coasts and our oceans are stressed because of increasing usage. So I thought Donovan.
Is this on? You can all hear me? Great. So my name's Beth Kurtula, and I'm the director of the National Ocean Council. I came here to Washington, D.C. about a year ago from Stanford, but before then, I grew up and lived in Alaska. I'm a third-generation Alaskan. So I really never lived more than 5 or 10 minutes from the coastline my entire life. I represented in the legislature a fishing district stretched from Petersburg, went up to Juneau, the state capital, and then reached into Skagway. So I grew up intimately connected with a lot of the same issues that we're facing on a national level now. But what drove me to come here really revolved around one resolution, not even a statute, not even a bill, that I introduced about 4 years ago into the state legislature, and it was a resolution on ocean acidification, just recognizing that acidification was happening, which in colder waters appears to be happening at a faster rate. So it got to committee, and I couldn't even get a hearing on the resolution. The chair refused to even allow people to talk about it. So it was one of those experiences that really sets you back on your heels when you realize you've probably reached the point of your patience and your limits in trying to have science involved in policy making. Luckily for me, I never would have thought I would be sitting here, and I really thank you for that opportunity, and I'm thrilled to be working in this position. But that drive to try to have good, sound science drive policy making and drive choices and help us do good things for the ocean helped me come here. 5 years ago, this nation embarked on a wonderful, wonderful experiment in the National Ocean Policy. It involves 9 regions around the United States, and it's also involving the federal agencies themselves. Now, it sounds sort of like, you know, cooperation among the federal agencies may not sound real sexy to you, but I want you to know that it is a phenomenal step forward in being able to have coordination among the federal agencies that work on ocean issues. Under the National Ocean Policy, we've recognized amazing steps in terms of that kind of cooperation and synergy and exciting things happening. Everything from working on ocean plastic and marine debris to working on the illegal, unregulated, unreported, I can never say it right, IUU fishing and seafood fraud that Dr. Sullivan spoke about earlier, to working on how do you work with local communities so that they make wise and good choices for the future of the ocean. And to that I can say there are 2 regions in the country today, the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic, that are closing in on the first ever marine plans. It's a phenomenal accomplishment, and it takes a lot of effort on the part of communities, local leaders, and the tribal leaders to get together to collaborate within themselves and then with the federal agencies to be able to stand up plans that will work on how we work together in the ocean. So it's all about community, it's all about you, it's all about people making good choices for the ocean. And that's why I'm here. It's very much a pleasure to be able to speak and to work with all of you. Thank you.
Thanks, Beth. Jonathan. Sure, absolutely.
So yesterday evening and today, I've noticed some familiar faces people that I ran into in 2010 when responding to the BP disaster. Where'd y'all go? Come back. We need you. I told David yesterday that I'll try not to scream or curse or yell, but I'm being asked to talk about what's been happening on what the oil and gas industry has done to the Gulf region. And as you heard, you know, I'm born and raised. I got into this fight because of my experiences during Hurricane Katrina. I was in my 2nd year of law school. I had security clearance to get into the city. I was bringing in baby formula and supplies and also boats. And I was floating around New Orleans, my hometown, listening for voices in attics. I saw dead babies on the road, old people tied up to telephone poles so they don't float away. And like a lot of people, I became very curious, why was Katrina so impactful? And quickly learned that we've lost 2,000 square miles of wetlands between us and the Gulf of Mexico. So the BP disaster, in my opinion, is just part of the biggest environmental disaster that's been going on in the Gulf region for decades. And so as there's a push to expand drilling on the Atlantic and in the Arctic, people have been asking me to tell my story. What have I been seeing? So I thought I'd show you guys some photos, but I'll also tell you, this is the truth. We've lost 2,000 square miles of land. At least 600, probably closer to half of that is directly attributable to the oil and gas industry. We have uncontrolled blowouts gushing hundreds of millions of gallons of oil into our water, our marsh, our beaches. We have destruction of sensitive fish habitat like coral reefs. There's been over 9,000 leaks and spills since April 2010, not related to the BP disaster in the Gulf region. Over 9,000. We've had countless dead dolphins, sea turtles, marine mammals, birds like brown pelicans, contaminated beaches and wildlife refuges, deployment of horrible toxic dispersants. Now, if you didn't know, they're dumping fracking chemicals into the Gulf of Mexico every day. Yes, they're fracking in the Gulf of Mexico. We have countless toxic waste pits all across the coast. Many of them are unlined, they're leaking. We have the contamination of our drinking water, our creeks, our rivers, our bayous that feed into the Gulf. We have oil train incidents, disasters, explosions. We have oil tankers. Just recently, there was a tanker going down the Mississippi River that leaked Bakken crude into the Mississippi River. We have tens of thousands of abandoned, unmonitored, tens of thousands of abandoned, unmonitored wells, many of which are leaking. We've got explosions, killing and maiming workers. We've got toxic releases from refineries. We've got devastation of communities. We've got loss of entire cultures. We've got shrimp with no eyes. We've got fish with lesions and tumors. We've got entire oyster beds that have gone, that have disappeared. We've got destroyed family businesses. We've got destroyed families. We've got suicides. We have sick people. We have dead people. And we have dying cleanup workers. There's widespread anger. There's fear. There's hatred. There's desperation and depression. And there's distrust of our government. There's environmental injustice and there's environmental racism. There are broken dreams, there are broken hearts, there are broken promises, and there are lies. There's dangerous infrastructure that's unable to withstand even a Category 1 hurricane, like Hurricane Isaac in 2012. There's a sunken platform 11 miles off the coast of Louisiana that's been leaking since 2004, and nothing that the industry or the government has been able to do has stopped the leak 24 hours a day, 7 days a week since 2004, when Hurricane Ivan knocked over the Taylor Energy platform. You can look at the AP story that ran about 3 weeks ago. Or you can come down to the Gulf and I'll show you. We've got sea level rise. We've got subsidence. We've got political corruption, regulatory capture, and the hijacking of our democracy by bought and paid for elected officials. Yet people who stand up for the environment and the Gulf are labeled by the industry as tree huggers or liberals or job killers. The jobs aren't going anywhere. All the oil's there. The infrastructure is there. When the price of oil went down, Baker Hughes laid off 10,000 workers. It's all lies. I ask this question: what could be more patriotic than defending our homeland? Why does the industry control this narrative? What could be more patriotic than defending our own soil? What good is our air if it's polluted? What's good of our water if it's contaminated? Our soil if we can't grow on it? Our food if we can't eat it? Come to the Gulf of Mexico and we'll show you. And those of you that were there in 2010, please come back. We need you. And finally, in all due respect to the Commandant, we're losing a football field of wetlands every hour, not every day. By the time this panel is over, we'll have lost another football field of vital storm protection that won't be able to defend our coast and communities. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Jonathan. Last but not least, Councilmember Donovan.
Well, good morning. It is an honor to be here, and I want to thank Blue Summit for certainly inviting me to be here today. I'm New York City Councilmember Donovan Richards, and I have the honor of representing the best people of New York City, all 160,000 people I represent of the neighborhoods of Laurelton, Rosedale, Springfield Gardens, parts of JFK, and also the Rockaways, which was an area that was certainly devastated during Hurricane Sandy, and I certainly can relate to what Jonathan said. I wasn't elected yet as a city council member of the district, but had the honor of working with the prior city council member, and government just did not arrive. They did not arrive during the storm. We literally did not see government or any services for nearly 3 weeks. So we were left on the ground by ourselves. I mean, we worked out of, we had no lights. We literally had to work out of an office with no lights and set it up as a supply center so that communities, people of the community can get the basic necessities their babies even needed. Pampers, baby food. I mean, people lost everything during the storm. And I was very unfortunate. So when I became a city council member, I was elected in 2013. One of the first things I did was I lobbied to be the chair of the Environmental Protection Committee because I thought we needed to have someone in the seat who certainly understood what was going on the ground, but also it was important for us to seize it for several reasons. One, obviously, enacting policies that would represent the people of my district and be in support of what they would want to see. Secondly, one of the things many people don't know, we see the big Broadway lights when we come to New York City, but we forget that there are communities in New York City who literally have no infrastructure. I mean, there are communities in New York City that I represent that literally had no storm sewers, no sewers. You know, waste was going directly into the bay. You know, so this is a reality for us, but I do want to say that we've been leading on several fronts in this area, and she spoke of $400 million that we certainly got the mayor to commit last fiscal year. This year, we got him to up it up to $1.2 billion. And two areas we're focusing on is obviously doing storm sewer build out, which is gray infrastructure, but green infrastructure is also a critical component here as well. And we'll be focused on ensuring that many communities like the Rockaways, who have not historically had an equitable share of funding sources, that they now will be able to do it. We've also got engaged in a recent fight. Now, one, I'm not sure if many people in this room know that New York State is fracking free now, that we've enacted a ban on fracking. And I know I saw the Surfriders in here. They were certainly an important part of that conversation. And now we find ourselves at the latter end of another fight, which is a company called Liberty LLC Gas wants to enact a liquefied natural gas port off of Long Island in the Rockaways, around 20 miles or 30 miles off the coast. And I'm happy to say, as of yesterday, my committee literally just passed a resolution to call on the governor to veto that application, and the full city council will vote on the application on Thursday, and I anticipate overwhelming support. We got bipartisan support in this area, both Republicans and Democrats, to certainly support this effort, because we should be looking towards a renewable future, certainly, and I think wind is not a bad idea for that location, and there's a competing application for a wind farm actually there. Some other things that we've been focused on, and obviously we've had a huge erosion problem on the coastline of the community I represent. And for those who don't know what the Rockaways is, it's a beach front community, a coastline community, but it's also a community where the tale of two New York cities actually exist. And I represent the poorer part of the Rockaways, where around 30 to 40% of my residents are on some sort of income subsidy. You have a lot of seniors, a lot of senior residents, a lot of senior homes. You have middle-class families who are just ecking by. And these people literally lost everything during the storm, and many people are still not back in their homes as of today. We've been working on certainly with the Army Corps of Engineers, and we're now pumping around 3.5 million cubic square feet of sand on the beach as we speak today. We also literally just held a meeting with the Army Corps to speak of the Bay. Jamaica Bay, which is the area that surrounds our community as well. So when Sandy hit, we not only got hit by the ocean, but we also hit by the bay. And so it's important to know that. So we also are talking of wetland restoration, because that is, we've let the wetlands decay, just as he spoke of, for far too long. And we know that the wetlands obviously serves a dual purpose, for the environment, but also it serves as a protective barrier for the communities that I represent. We've also been planting dunes along the beach, and that's something that we work very closely with students in my district. The Rockaway Waterfront Alliance has been very helpful on. And then I also mentioned green infrastructure before. Some bigger items we're looking at doing in New York City policy, things that we're focused on right now. We know plastic bags are a huge contributor, pollutant to the ocean. So we are looking, and we've introduced, I'm a co-sponsor along with my colleagues, Councilmember Brad Lander and Margaret Chen, to enact a 10-cent charge on plastic bags in New York City. And as you may know, industry is certainly pushing back. But we are at a very interesting time in New York City, where we have a progressive city council, a progressive mayor. And so we have really been letting industry know in one sense that it is a new day, and that the question of jobs, which is, we always hear, but we often ask where are these jobs going, because people in our communities are not getting them. So that's an area we're focused on. We also just announced a major plan, which I co-chaired. The Mayor de Blasio actually selected me to co-chair his plan called One New York City, which is a $2.2 billion investment on making New York City more environmentally sound. So we're looking to install solar panels on every city building by 2025, including NYCHA. And it's important that I speak of environmental justice communities, because these are the communities that have the poorest air quality. In New York City, 2,000 New Yorkers are still dying from poor air quality every year, and most of them in the most vulnerable communities of our city. So there's a lot going on along the coast. As you can hear, we are really pushing for more green infrastructure, like I said a little bit earlier. We also have the mayor's also come up with a pot of money, around $100 million, which will be focusing on the coast with coastline arms for bulkhead remediation and other gray infrastructure as well. We also just enacted and actually had the first initiative enacted in the city council, which I founded, the Greener NYC initiative. And I know New York Aquarium is in the room. They're a recipient of this grant. It's almost about $1 million pot of money, which focuses on, which goes to nonprofits, because it's important that we are putting resources into the hands of the people who are literally doing the work every day with our children in schools, our children on the ground, our communities. So it's $1 million initiative that focuses on climate education, green jobs training, because we should be ensuring that we can put people to work. So it doesn't take a Harvard degree, I always say, to install a solar panel. So we should be helping those who may not have the highest degree to be able to get into the green market. And also climate education, which is something important. We need to start teaching our kids about the importance of preserving the environment and what surrounds them. A lot of children may live along the bay and don't know what the purpose of the bay serves. We also have some legislation which I co-sponsored, which would require every New York City school to enact climate education. So every student is getting climate education in New York City, because we know climate change is real. And then just lastly, before I get off this stage, because I know I'm supposed to speak 5 to 7 minutes, probably over that by now. Am I over that, David? Oh, yeah, I certainly am. So the last point I'll make is on affordability. And we are certainly have an affordable housing crisis in New York City. Over 60,000 people are homeless in New York City, around 20,000 of them being children. And Sandy not only devastated our communities, but we know flood insurance now comes into play now. We know that flood insurance is going to rise. So not only are people rebuilding their homes or trying to rebuild their homes, but now they're going to be hit with these increases that they cannot really afford, which means gentrification can take place, because what happens when they can't afford to stay in their home, they're foreclosed on. And then before you know it, and which we do, we have a lot of developers knocking on our doors who now all of a sudden have discovered this place, the Rockaways. So maintaining affordability, and we're considering doing things like land trust in the community. And most developers who come our way, they cannot have a conversation with me unless they are going to speak of how much affordable housing they are going to have in our district. And we just literally are about to break ground on 100% affordable housing project in my district, which is also passive house as well. High standards, solar panels, and that's the standard that we want in our community if people are going to come. So with that being said, I want to thank you once again for having me. I can go on, I can keep going. We got a lot of other good policies going on in the city, but I want to thank you for taking the time out to hear me. Thank you.
All right, well, that was motivating, if not inspiring, even if it's a little bit daunting to look at some of the photos and to hear the stories about the devastation in the Rockaways and in the southern part of New York City. So I have a few questions, and we talked a little bit about these questions yesterday, but they already answered a lot of them in the course of their remarks. So I don't want to hit anybody with a curveball here, but I will say it's interesting to me, having been a part of the federal policy apparatus. We have this national ocean policy that came out of the plan. How does that connect to the very real problems that we just heard Jonathan and Donovan talk about? Beth, can you tell us how you can use that plan to make to support their efforts on the ground?
First, I just want to say both of you were extremely powerful speakers, and it's a real honor to get to share the stage with you. You know, when I listen to the stories about what's happened in your communities, it hits home how important all of the work is, and it inspires me to keep going, because some days when you just hear about the issues and the problems and you get stuck in some kind of a bureaucratic issue, you just feel like you're in glue and it's hard to move. But what I want to say about national ocean policy and the planning that happens there is that this is exactly what it's about. And it's exactly about stopping the destruction of the wetlands. It's about restoring the wetlands. It's about carbon sequestration in the wetlands. How do we turn that picture around so that you're positively using the coastline, so that you don't have the coastal erosion, so that you don't lose the coral reefs? And you know how it would be, some days you do just sit and you're daunted by it. But you know, when I first came, I would not have believed the work that is going on inside the federal agencies and between the agencies to solve these kinds of issues and to move forward is tremendous. This administration believes in this. It believes in the ocean. It believes in the coastlines. And it's working really hard to be sure that we stop the destruction so that our communities can survive. Want to do it in conjunction with saving jobs, with being able to save our fisheries, to be able to have a healthy economy, and that's where the planning comes in. If you don't plan, you're not going to be able to step forward. You're not going to have the kind of development that will help people. But it was just a wonderful reminder of why this is also important. It doesn't sound real sexy, you know, when you're talking about intergovernmental coordination, or you're talking about planning, right? Or even worse, right? I'm the federal government and I'm here to help you. In Alaska, that doesn't play so well. But in reality, if we don't do those things, then this is what we have. So in my heart, that's why we're doing this. And one final thing before I let it go, the other incredibly important piece of it is the data. the data portals, the information that Dr. Sullivan was talking about, and also making it in usable ways so that communities and regions understand what's happening. Where is the sea level rise coming? What will happen if you build on that coastline and you get another storm? So open government, open data, used in a way that can help the regions make their plans. That's what this is all about. Thanks.
Either of you have a comment on any of that? I mean, I guess I would ask both Jonathan and Donovan whether you see any impacts coming down from the federal government through this national ocean policy or the plan, and if not, how could you help, or how could they help you? How could you reach each other? Because I know of what Beth is speaking about, how hard it is when you're sitting at the top of an enormous federal government, looking out at an enormous country with a huge coastline. How can you all in the state and local government help the federal government help you? What can you do?
I'll take a shot at that. I think that, you know, one way I like to operate is certainly not from a top to bottom approach, but certainly a bottom up to top approach. And I'm saying that in all honesty because we just actually got the Army Corps finally since Sandy to come out to finally present plans or propose plans of what they want to do to help ensure that our peninsula is protected better in the event of a storm. You know, we were leaders at the People's Climate March. I think that march certainly pushed a little bit of everyone to take climate change a little bit more serious. You know, environmental work is not the sexiest work. Let's be honest. Not everybody, you know, it's very hard to get the press to continuously want to cover these areas. But now they're a little bit more alert, at least the New York media market. So I would say in terms of working with the Fed, it's going to be very important that we have elected officials, certainly in capacity, at the federal level who are very sensitive to our issues. And I know my job as a city council member, even though I'm a city local level council member, is to push the conversation, to push the needle a little bit more. And this is why we oppose things like the TPP. You know, we weigh in on these particular conversations because they're very important that we ensure that policymakers and people who are supposed to represent the best interests of our districts and of this country at the end of the day, that they understand that they have to answer to the people on the ground. So I think that's where I've used my leverage at, but certainly I would say working to build coalitions as well on the ground is something important. And you know, I even as a government official, now I guess I can say that, I don't place my faith in government. I think that the people in this room are the people who can push policy and can push lawmakers and people to address the issues that we want them to address by being consistent, laser focused. What do we want to see? Because a lot of times, even when people come to me, they have 1,000 different ideas. What are some laser focus areas that we can focus on to get real change? And I think that's what I would say what we would do to push the federal government a little bit more.
Jonathan, what would you do? What would you tell Beth right now, right here, you need?
Well, just briefly, I would tell Beth or anybody who would listen, it would be nice if we can get an executive order from the White House holding the oil and gas industry accountable for repairing the wetlands. You know, everything in the Gulf of Mexico is somehow connected to our wetlands. And so it is part of the commons. But, you know, our wetlands are governed by the state of Louisiana. The state of Louisiana has a very ambitious coastal master plan for restoration and protection. It envisions if we had $50 billion, which the cost will obviously be a lot higher than that. These are all the projects that we will do to get a net acre of land gained by the year 2050. But we don't have $50 billion, and we're not going to get $50 billion from the federal government. We're relying on now eventual Clean Water Act fines from the BP disaster. We're relying on some of the early restoration dollars that have come out of that. And we had some money from FEMA. and the QIPA program, but we're never going to get the amount of money that we need. But what we do have is a culpable party. They're not the oil and gas industry isn't the only industry that destroyed Louisiana's wetlands, but they've caused at least 40 to 60% of the damage. And right now, there are projects where tax dollars are being used to rebuild wetlands in Louisiana that were decimated by the oil and gas industry. And that's just wrong. That's not justice. Why are we paying to rebuild oil fields that were created by Texaco or Shell or BP or whoever?
Let me just say two things. It's interesting that you focus on the oil and gas industry. I thought maybe you would talk a little bit about the Corps of Engineers and, water projects. That certainly has contributed. It was a previous set of policies that we've changed now about water resource projects in the federal government. So hopefully we'll start to do less of that kind of destruction ourselves. I will also say the Corps of Engineers, for all the raps they get, they were the ones pumping out your tunnel at the, in the midst of the storm, essentially. I was at the DOD then and sitting in the situation room with the Corps of Engineers flying back and forth. Actually, they're the only people in the world who knew how to do the kind of sophisticated pumping that needed to happen when the tunnel flooded. So in the moment, I know the federal government was there, but I can't speak to what happened right afterwards. I don't know whether that was sufficient. Probably not, given your remarks. So how do we prepare for the next storm? You're doing the things that you can on the ground. What do you think the federal government ought to have ready to go? When I think about contingency operations and what we spend on overseas contingency operations, which isn't even our basic defense spending, it's the extra spending we spend for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It's about $60 billion, I think, is what's proposed for next year. What do you think the federal government ought to have in reserve? What kinds of resources do you think they ought to have ready to be able to deal with the next Katrina or the next Sandy? And I would ask that of all three panelists.
What should they have ready? It's a very hard. I mean, there are a multitude of things that they should have ready, and that's just basic organization. I would say having people who know the communities and know the ground, because even when FEMA finally made their way in, they were a little lost, and that's my honest opinion. I'd also say coordination amongst all levels of government. I think that there was a huge disconnect on the ground between the feds, the state, the local government. There was absolutely no coordination. So I think that's important. And I think resources is an understatement. I think that ensuring that local governments have the sort of monies that they need to be successful in the event of these storms is important. I also think that, once again, we're talking of coastal resiliency, coastal sustainability, ensuring that local governments have the resources. And I think that, every time we speak with our partners in government, that seems to be the real question. And I also want to just raise equity again, because I think it's very important that we continue to ensure that this is at the forefront of all conversations. Like I said, the Rockaways is a divided community. You have some people who have $1 million homes, and then you have people who really are just holding on by the thread. And I think even when government came in, there was not a focus on the most vulnerable amongst us. And it was a huge disconnect where one side got more resources. Even as we speak today, there are some parts of the Rockaways that are being rebuilt faster than where we have the most vulnerable people at. Senior citizens. I represent over 20,000 public housing residents. I can't say that the feds are not doing anything. I want to be clear, we are getting a substantial amount of money to finally make our public housing developments more resilient, more sustainable. But the money needs to come faster. There's a lot of bureaucracy. There's always a lot of red tape When people are going for reimbursement, there's just a whole bunch of bureaucracy, a whole bunch of red tape. That's the two words that I will say that I would hope that we can cut through. God forbid there's another storm, but we know that that's not it's a reality now that climate change is here. So I would say not playing games with homeowners who are trying to receive a check to rebuild their homes and then having them resubmit paperwork 1,000 times, the same paperwork that they lost. That can be one way that, certainly they can be helpful in the event of a next storm. But protection, investment in infrastructure, green and gray, wetlands, and cutting the bureaucracy, absolutely.
Jonathan, anything? I know. I want to give each of them a chance to respond. That's all.
I'll just pass on that one for the interest of time. I probably already said a bunch of it.
Okay.
So similarly, I just want to say plan ahead. I want to invite you guys to come into the regions when we're doing the planning to speak up. I don't think you'll have any trouble with that because you'll have the federal agencies, the regional partners there at the table so that these kinds of things get heard and get instituted so that people can be prepared ahead to not let these things happen and continue to happen, which is the totally crazy making part of it. And I want to say one last thing, which is ocean planning in this administration is all about the ground up. It's all about the local choices. It's one of the fundamental pieces of it. The hard part is it just takes an enormous amount of time, any kind of time you're working with that many agencies, that big a government. So I hear you. I'll carry that message back, and you guys are doing a great job. Thank you.
All right, that's a great way to end. I'm sorry we can't take questions from the audience. We are out of time. The other panel before us went a little bit long, and we want to make sure everybody gets lunch. So I just want to say thank you very much to these three very eloquent, passionate, and devoted ocean advocates, ocean lovers, and thank you and wish you all a great conference the rest of the day.
So we're going to have one final, the food is here, but we're going to wait for one final panel, which is really about what we're doing tomorrow and what we're doing into the 2016 elections. I don't know if you saw in your packet, we have the Sea Party rebellion. We're going to need something at the level of Tea Party, a Sea Party. We got better costumes anyway, to talk about, why it's insane on the 5th anniversary of BP and when the science tells us we have to leave at least 30% of known reserves of oil in the ground and under the seabed. Why would we even think about opening up the Atlantic seaboard where we have a healthy blue economy, and the Arctic, of frontier waters where we know disaster is imminent, where the commandant just told us we don't have the resources to respond. And so, what our ask tomorrow on the Hill is, hey, we're asking, don't do this, it's insane. And this next panel is, I'm going to introduce Jackie Savitz, who for years has been fighting for the ocean. She's vice president of oceans at Oceana. And she has a tremendous panel of people. We're going to talk about our strategies, how we're going to stop them. And I do believe 30 years ago in California, they tried to do this. And we not only stopped them, but we ended up with some beautiful marine sanctuaries, and we can do it again. Jackie.
Thanks so much, David. Hi, everyone. The panelists are getting in their places. As I was thinking about how to put this panel into context for you, I thought about a story that really starts back in 2008. And if you'll remember 2008, that was the year that we heard the famous phrase, drill, baby, drill, really take hold. That was the presidential election, and drill, baby, drill became the rallying cry of the Republican ticket. And I don't really think any of us were ready for having our issue elevated to that level of presidential election politics as it was. And I don't think we really had the organization to fight it. And there's a good reason why we didn't have that organization. We didn't have it because there were literally 2 standing moratoria against the expansion of drilling to the Pacific and the Atlantic. There was a presidential moratorium and there was a congressional moratorium. The presidential moratorium, George W. Bush withdrew the presidential moratorium in 2008 in an effort to open up the Pacific and the Atlantic to offshore drilling. And that was the moratorium that was put in place by his own father back in 1990. It stood for 18 years until he withdrew it. And not only did he do that, but he also called on Congress to withdraw their moratorium. So that was a congressional moratorium that was reinstated every single year, year after year after year, for 25 years. Through Republican Congresses and Democratic Congresses, it was reliable, and it was preventing expansion of drilling into the Pacific and the Atlantic. And when Congress withdrew that moratorium, it was open season on drilling in both oceans. And we weren't ready to fight that. And so we thought, well, we better build some organization here. We better figure out how to stand up to this, and let's go to Congress and try to fight to get that moratorium back in place. When we talked about doing that, people said, oh, you think you're gonna win that? You also believe in Santa Claus? So it wasn't looking good. We started to build that organization around the same time that President Bush put out his first draft plan for where we were going to drill over the 5-year period between 2012 and 2017. That's how they do it. The presidents get to figure out what they want to do for 5 years at a time. Once they put that in place, that's the plan. And his plan was to open up the Pacific and the Atlantic. And we were very concerned about this. And luckily, he wasn't president much longer. And President Obama came in. And we thought, well, we have a chance here. And what did President Obama do? But he put out his first draft plan. And in his plan, he also envisioned drilling in the Atlantic, not in the North Atlantic. He said, no, we won't drill above the New Jersey-Delaware boundary, but we want to drill the Mid and South Atlantic, and we're not going to drill in the Pacific. So it was a little better, but it was still a really huge concern. And I remember talking to David Hayes, who at the time was the Deputy Secretary for the Interior, the agency responsible for leasing areas for offshore drilling, and asking David, why did you take out the Pacific and the North Atlantic, but not the Mid and the South Atlantic? And David said, because the people there don't want it. The people there don't want offshore drilling. Well, I have news for you. I live in the Mid-Atlantic, and the people there don't want offshore drilling either. And the people in the South Atlantic, they don't want offshore drilling either. But they hadn't made their voices heard. So good for you guys on the West Coast and the North Atlantic, but we still had some work to do here. We needed to organize. And so we set out to do that. And we put a small field team in place. It's still in place today. Our field organizers are here today. But before we could really get very far in the organizing, in 2010, of course, the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster happened. And that was a time when we all watched for 87 days as oil gushed into the Gulf of Mexico, 200 million gallons of oil, and there was nothing that could be done to stop it. We were told by the government it will take 3 months to drill a relief well, and sure enough, it did. And we watched day after day after day. I think any one of us in this room would have thrown our bodies on the top of that drill pipe if it would have stopped the gushing, right? And we all knew, not just those of us in this room, we all as a country knew, and even beyond the United States, we knew that offshore drilling, at that moment, we knew it was dirty and it was dangerous, and that we needed a better way. And we all knew it. There was no question. Nobody would argue that. And that moment in time lasted for a few months, and then it was back to business as usual, and we were back to drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, and we were back to talking about drilling in the Atlantic. Well, I'm happy to report that that 5-year drilling plan that President Obama finalized for 2012 to 2017 did not include the Atlantic. He saw the light. He withdrew the Atlantic, and we basically got a 5-year moratorium in place at that time. In 2012, we knew we had 5 years, but we also knew that we would be back here fighting this again 5 years later, and that's what we're doing today. And we've been fighting it ever since. We've been building. We didn't make that mistake again. We didn't get complacent, and we've been building opposition along the coast, as you'll see. And we started with trying to stop the use of seismic air guns. Seismic air guns are a technology that's used to look for oil. It's the first step to drilling for offshore oil, and it's a prerequisite for drilling to offshore oil. So we worked to stop seismic air guns. And we worked, and a little over a year ago, we had a breakthrough when a little town in North Carolina rose up against its leadership because its leadership came out in support of the use of seismic air guns, and the town thought that was a bad idea. And soon after that, another town in North Carolina stepped up and passed a resolution opposing seismic air guns. And now today we have 60 cities and towns along the southeast that have stood up and said no and passed formal resolutions against seismic air guns, thanks to the work of a lot of the people in this room, Oceana organizers, other organizations on the coast that have been doing this. 60 towns. Recently, Columbia, South Carolina, the capital of South Carolina, opposing seismic testing, some of them seismic testing and offshore drilling. And this is what we need. But a year from now, we need that to be 600 towns. And so all of us in this room can look at the towns we live in, the cities we live in. They don't have to be coastal. Columbia, South Carolina is not coastal the last time I checked. And we can say, we can pass a resolution in our town too. And if you want to, so we have a great panel here today to talk to you about these issues. We have Michael Stocker. He's an expert on sound in the ocean. He's going to share with us seismic air guns, why seismic air guns are a problem, and other sounds that come from offshore drilling. We have Mayor Johnny Miller from Fernandina Beach, who's one of the leaders that passed a resolution in his town and is now working with other towns to get us higher, to get us to more people, because the more people that say, we don't want this, the better chance we have of winning. And I also want to point out that already 60 members of Congress, including Senator Whitehouse, have stepped up against seismic testing. Just recently, Mark Sanford of South Carolina stepped out against seismic testing. We're seeing movement, the Restaurant Association and Hotel Association in Virginia Beach just last week. So it's more than just those 60 towns. And there is an alternative. And the alternatives are out there. Offshore wind is a perfect example of something that, if done right, could actually be a big part of the solution, because offshore wind can provide us in the Atlantic more jobs and more energy than offshore drilling. It never spills, and it will never run out. And so we can make the transition away from fossil fuels and away from offshore drilling and towards offshore wind and solve a lot of problems at once. We can solve oil spills, we can help solve climate change, we can bring clean energy and jobs. And so we have Stephanie McClellan here with a special initiative on offshore wind. And Stephanie formerly worked with the Atlantic Wind Connection, which is the Google-backed effort to build transmission lines in the Atlantic so that we can have offshore wind, and also for Governor Markell of Delaware. And she's going to share with us more about offshore wind and how we make that a reality. So basically what you have with this panel here is the solution to offshore drilling. We stop seismic, we stop drilling, we stand up in our communities and make an uproar, and then we build a clean energy for the future. So with that, let me turn it over to Michael Stocker.
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. Let's see if I can get this up here. I'm really honored to be here, by the way. It's an amazing group of people out there in the audience, the work that's being done here. This conference itself is probably one of the most positive impacts on ocean policy and ocean planning. So I'm honored and thrilled to be up here. And I'm trying to find where my, somebody hit it. AV guy? Where's our, but last week I was at a conference that was probably the most damaging to the ocean conference. It was really amazing. I go to conferences all the time. Last week I was at a conference in Texas, in Houston, called the Offshore Technologies Conference. There are over 90,000 people who attended there. No, it was actually on the, 90,000 people attended there, and they're all kicking tires on some pieces of equipment that they're putting on the ocean floor, some pieces of equipment that are the size of this auditorium. And they're operating under amazingly hostile conditions, and they're creating essentially factory floors on the Outer Continental Shelf. And I'm going to go over that really briefly. The GWIS factor is really high. You can go push a straw 10,000 feet and then down to the ocean bottom, and another 40,000 feet out to a deposit and suck it up. It takes an amazing amount of technology in, there we are. So, and I'm rolling ahead with this, right? So, deep water fossil fuel technologies, and how are we going, how are we moving this thing here? Here we go. Okay, so what happens after the air guns hit the water? Fossil fuel development, exploration and production involves a whole bunch of different phases in order to find it, to figure out how productive it can be, stick the straws in the ground, and pull product out, offload it, process it. It's a whole bunch of different steps, and each one of those steps has its risks, its liabilities, its and its noise, which is what my specialty is. The operating conditions are extreme. The wellhead pressure of the BP oil disaster, first off, the hydrostatic pressure down there, how much the water pressure was around 2,500 pounds per square inch, but the pressure at the wellhead was 13,000 pounds per square inch. Now, to get an idea of how much pressure that is, your standard industrial sandblaster, you hear them on bridges and things like that, that's about 300 pounds per square inch. And so it's a lot of pressure. That's one of the reasons why they can't just put their finger on a leaking oil well and plug it up. It's also not just oil, it's oil, brine, sand, gas, a whole mix of different things. And each one of those has their own noise characteristics and liabilities. That's what happened down there is they had what was called a gas kick, lost control of the wellhead. The temperature is particularly high, 200 degrees centigrade is not uncommon, and when you get out into deep water conditions, they're not just building these arbors that they're setting platforms on. Rather, they have these floating platforms that are in unstable conditions. So the air gun thing, which has captured everybody's imagination, of course, is problematic. This is a fairly small one. Lamont Doherty does a lot of these scientific geological studies. These are pretty small. This one here would maybe be a 1,200 cubic inch gun. It's something that might be used to actually locate and site wind farms, for example, see where it's logical to do that. The actual ones that they're using for the deep water are significantly larger. There's 6,000 cubic inch. This is Sydney Harbor, 10-kilometer trawls, these huge devices, and they basically set up these surveys. When they're first looking for oil and gas, they'll essentially block out the areas where they're going to find it, and once they've located it and they start production, they continue with the surveys. So the surveys don't stop when they start pumping oil out of the ground. They go on around the clock. They do quarterly surveys around the clock, 24 hours a day, week after week, and you can hear these air guns in some cases 2,000 and 3,000 miles away from the origin. So it's this pulsing. When they're close, it's a pulse, as you can imagine, explosion. But when you get into the far field, you have what's called multipath, and you basically get this roar. So another problem is when you get these rigs out there. They're not built up on these arbors, and they're not platforms that in a traditional sense. They have these floating platforms that are stabilized by these thrusters, these huge propellers that are constantly spinning. The more hostile the sea surface is, the more these things roar as well. They have anywhere from 6 to 8 thrusters on one of these platforms. It's like having 6 to 8 mid-size cargo ships all in that same location, kind of drilling away. And this to give you an idea of kind of the general size of these things. These are the size of the thrusters here. See these guys? And these thrusters are designed for high torque, and so they're not particularly quiet. They cavitate. That's why you saw the kind of foam around the skirt of that platform. And this is what happens here. They float these things, and then they set this equipment down on the floor here. As I say, they don't stick a straw in the sea bottom and pull out oil. They have these different materials, sand, brine, drilling muds, and they have to separate that. And they're separating that, again, at very high pressures, anywhere from 5,000 to up to 20,000 pounds per square inch. Not a formula for quiet. And they then pipe it around. This is a kind of a cartoon of Angola, past floor field. They have about 12 different areas with up to 20-kilometer tiebacks that all come to one floating production and storage and offloading platform here. So that's kind of what that looks like in the imaginal world underwater. This equipment here, as you see these little guys, this is a seafloor separator. This particular device here is actually a particularly large one. This is a multi-phase pump to repressurize the deposits. This is up in the North Sea right now. If Statoil's put it up, this is actually the largest single piece of equipment ever devised. Then each of these pieces of equipment also have acoustical modems that are basically announcing what their conditions are. They're constantly pulsing away. That's to give, you know, navigation cues to autonomous vessels that are servicing these things underwater. These are essentially acoustical modems that are operating between 20 kilohertz and 100 kilohertz, which is essentially the biosonar range of marine mammals, dolphins and porpoises, also vocalization range of many seals. So they're creating this kind of screechy, I wonder if I can get this to screech for us a little bit. These are actually, yeah, no, it's not going to do it for me, is it? Well, anyways, it's not a pleasant sound. So, and this is the one I want right here. Just play that one. The sound guy turned it down, but the dolphins and porpoises can't turn it down. Just let's put it that way. So, you know, this is problematic. They're creating these huge sound fields down there at the bottom of the ocean, and just to remind you, these are factory floors. This is what happens after the air guns find the oil. And nobody's talking about this right now because it's a very complex thing, but this is where it's happening globally right now. Interestingly enough, it's not happening in the Atlantic, in the Pacific, and it's happening a little bit up here, but that's kind of where it's happening. So that is kind of the general summary of this. There's a lot of noise that's going to go on down there. Nobody's telling us anything about it. They're not really, the regulators aren't looking at it at the moment. So I've got a bunch of these sheets here out on the table. They basically kind of condense all this information. For those of you who are going up in the hill, you look at it, see if you want to distribute that, particularly if you're going to see coastal legislators. There's a lot of them out there. Grab a handful or just grab one and share with those you love, the ocean. Okay, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, you can cue it up and I'll just show it when it's... Hi, good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming out today. Wow, what a great event. I attended yesterday and today, and listening to both the Coast Guard Commandant and everybody who spoke, I'm becoming more and more educated and also more and more terrified. I think a great lead-in was Jonathan from New Orleans who set this up properly. I don't know about you guys, but I was completely enthralled. That situation they have over there is what the future is for my community. I'm from Fernandina Beach, Florida. If you're familiar with our layout, if Florida is shaped like a gun, which doesn't escape, you know, me at all, and a lot of us who live there, the top part of the hammer would be where we are. We're right, just south of Georgia. We're right off Cumberland Island. The community of Fernandina Beach is on Amelia Island, and we're completely surrounded by water. I was elected about 1.5 years ago, and I was a proponent of the anti-plastic movement. One of the issues that's been near and dear to my heart for a long time, since we lived in Hawaii when they passed an amazing resolution there, was the complete abatement of one-time use plastic bags, which is a completely separate issue that is mind-boggling. The state of Florida will not allow us to pass a resolution restricting, counting, recording, anything to do with plastic bags because of the industry and the lobbyists. We just failed again, but we'll try again next year. But in the process of doing this, I was approached by a local resident who owns a kayak, and he does a lot of eco tours, and he's here on the island, long hair, ponytail, no shoes on, came up to me at City Hall and said, "Hey man, have you heard about the seismic air blasting?" Now, I'm familiar with this because I spent 20 years in the Navy, and I was an acoustic operator the last half of my career. We flew in reconnaissance aircraft. We dropped sonar buoys out of the back of our airplane, would send a hydrophone down, and we'd listen for submarines. And there's two types of sonar. There's active and there's passive. Everything we pretty much do is passive sonar, where we're listening to the environment around us. So we trained in that capacity. We learned about sound propagation. You mentioned multipath transmissions, the way it comes from different directions, cavitation, sound channels. So we know a lot about the ocean environment. And one of the things we study are whales and dolphins, because they've cornered the market on how to communicate underwater because they've been doing it for eons. That's their environment. That's their air. Sound is their light. So we use that. The sperm whales find sound channels so they can compress sound into an area, and we don't know how they do it, but they can actually, and we've heard it, they can send communications over thousands of miles and can communicate with each other from their breeding ground to their feeding ground, these family units. and we don't know how they can find them. It's got to be temperature, pressure. We don't know, but it's amazing. So when we put sound in the water, it interferes with what we're trying to do, hunting these quiet submarines. So we're trying to get rid of all that background noise. So when he said seismic air blasting, I immediately remembered one of those stars on that map. There are 2 or 3 of them that were in the Gulf region. And then, as you can imagine, with our carrier battle groups in that area recently, submarines operating in that area are a high commodity asset for us and want to know where they are at all times, the bad guy submarines. So I've heard it, and we've heard it in training, and it does go thousands of miles, and it's a constant background noise that we use computers to filter out of the way. And in my head, I'm going, what? That can't be good, you know, for all these animals, because my background before all this was a huge proponent of the ocean since I was a kid. They talked yesterday about sea hunt and the Cousteaus and all that. It's an honor to be on the same stage with the Cousteau. I can't believe I'm here. I mean, I'm just like a kid, you know, in a candy store. But what happens to these animals, and this goes on, and because we're studying whale and dolphin noise and see how they do, we're hearing those too, and we're hearing them together. And the answer I got back was basically, well, it's probably not good. You know, it's not something that we don't want to talk about. The Navy does some training with explosive buoys that use sound charges that I was involved in Hawaii, and we do mitigation for that. We send out passive buoys where we listen for the area first. We make sure there's no marine mammals in the environment before we deploy these buoys. And if we do find them we scuttle the buoys and send them to the bottom, and it stops, which I'll get back to in a second. But so I understood where he was coming from with this whole issue with sound blasting and seismic research. And I thought, this is a conspiracy theory guy. This can't be happening. I mean, this at the time, it's 3.5, 4 years after Deepwater Horizon. I mean, the only reason to do this is to explore for oil, and they're not going to do that off our coast. I mean, we're Florida, we're the tourist area, the whole eastern seaboard. We have a clean beach. We had to have learned from that. So I did a little bit of research just to appease the guy, and lo and behold, we're looking for oil off our coast. I'm sorry, I didn't know I'd do this. Wow. It's mind-boggling to me that we're actually considering looking for oil off the coast after hearing what happened in New Orleans. I mean, I'm going to New Orleans, by the way. If Jonathan's still here, I'm coming to see you, and I'm going to put this all online and show what could happen to us. Just what's going to happen to these animals alone, not even think about the end result if they actually find something. These seismic companies that are applying for permits right now, they're going to blast, and they're going to do this over and over again. And they're telling us they're going to do mitigation. They're going to have somebody on that vessel that's going to listen like we did in the Navy and try to find out if there's animals in the area. So I went to BOM when they came to Jacksonville, and I talked to them after an event that we had in Jacksonville Beach. And they didn't know who I was, so I'm asking questions, and he's talking about how they're going to use passive sonar to track these animals and make sure they're not there. So I asked how you're going to get dual contact on multiple sensor arrays in order to get a cross fix on where the animal actually is if it's not emitting sound. And the guy looked at me and went, you know, who are you again? So you can't. And then he said the key thing is it's only 500 yards from the source. 500 meters from the source. 500 meters is an event that I swam when I swam in high school. That's nothing. And there's no whale that's coming within 500 meters of just a ship in general. They're talking about looking visually with binoculars, trying to see animals on the surface spouting. You look, you've got sea state, you've got darkness, and you've got a guy. I've stood watch on the ship before. You're not going to see it. And if you see it, they're going to say, are you sure? Now you're that guy. You're that guy on that boat who it turns out is paid by the oil companies or trained by the oil company. You've been out there for 3 or 4 months. You don't go home until you find something and you see a whale or you hear one. And they say, are you sure? You've got to go 3 meals a day in the mess decks with these guys. You're the guy that's going to send this ship home. That's their mitigation technique. That's how they're going to keep us from hurting whales. It's not feasible. It doesn't make any sense at all. So obviously we can't do this. We can't fill the water with this sound. I mean, we just can't do it. And oil exploration, that probably, I mean, we're not going to let that happen. It just can't. I mean, it's not going to happen off our coast, but they could still seismic test. Even I went to Oceana yesterday and I talked to them. I'm jumping around, but when I did this research, I reached out and I found Oceana, and I found Erin Handy, who's a Florida representative for Oceana, and I reached out to her and she immediately got back to me. I said, hey, what do we do about this? I mean, is this real? And she said, yeah, it's real, and this is really happening right now. I'm like, well, why don't we know about this? And how come this isn't all in every front page newspaper in Florida? So we introduced a resolution, and I don't know how much you know about Florida small town politics, but this resolution caught everybody. When she got up and gave her presentation, every member of our city committee, every commissioner up there, immediately voted for this resolution to take place. They were dumbfounded as I was. I mean, it was just incredible that it was even an issue. Flew through. So I said, Aaron, please use me however you want. I've been to several things with her, and it's amazing what Oceana is doing. Florida, I think the last count was about 20, 25 resolutions. The city of Jacksonville, we went and just spoke to the mayor. Their committee, their mayor just said that he's introducing a resolution. And if you know what a resolution is, it's not an ordinance. It's not a law. It's just us telling everybody else, we don't support this. We don't want this to happen. A lot of coastal Florida cities have done this. So Oceana really, really came through for that. And we go on, and all these other cities are jumping on board and doing this as well. So we can probably stop the oil exploration, but the seismic blasting, they're permitting right now. And there's more than one company. They don't share this information. It's not one company going out there and sending all this horrible sounds out into the ocean, and then they're done. There's another one behind that because it's all proprietary. They're trying to gain information to sell to oil companies to say, here's where oil is, here's where gas is, and here's where it's not. And they're going to sell to the highest bidder. They don't care if a resolution or a law gets passed they can't explore for the next 5 years. That data is good for 10, 20, 30 years. They want that data, and they're going to keep it, and they're going to hang on to it. So we can't let them go out there and get the data. That's what we have to stop. We have to stop the actual testing itself, for them to go out and put these things in the water and blast away. If they find it, then we end up in the situation New Orleans in 5 years from now. We're going to end up with oil rigs off our coast. And that's what people just don't get, is they're tree huggers, you're dolphin huggers, you love the whale, you're whale people. But the end result is you're going to have oil rigs off your coast. I mean, I can't believe we have to go to the hill, and I traveled all the way up here to go tell people something so obvious that just cannot happen. So I want to show a video real quick, if you don't mind. Can you set this up for me, because I'm not going to be able to do it. This is it's a satirical video. Some of you may have seen it, but it kind of puts in perspective of what we're dealing with. It's really short.
10's Late News with Tracy Spicer.
Tonight, there are concerns tonight a whale found floating off Victoria's southeast coast could have died as a result of survey work carried out by an oil company. The whale was discovered by an ESO seismic survey crew about 26 nautical miles off Lake's entrance in East Gippsland. Sharks have been in a feeding frenzy around the carcass. Local fishermen say they're concerned about the effects underwater geological work could have on marine life. However, ESO says it hadn't started its survey when the whale was found, and the frequency given out by its equipment wouldn't hurt a whale.
This week, John Clark and Brian Dawes' attention was distracted from the election campaign by a curious story that caught their eye, but just might not have caught yours. A whale was found dead last Saturday off Lake's entrance in Victoria, in an area where a multinational energy company is conducting seismic tests for oil and gas.
Minister, thanks for your time.
Well, thank you for inviting me on the program. It's good to be here.
I'd like to ask you about this incident where a whale died this week.
Yes, very sad indeed, yes.
Yeah. What exactly happened?
This is just the one the other day?
Yeah.
In Bass Strait? Whale that died of old age?
Well, it didn't, did it?
This is the one down at Lake's entrance?
Yeah.
In the area where they do the seismic testing?
Yeah.
Yeah, died of old age.
Well, how do you know that?
Well, you don't so much know it as it's a question of likelihood. As I understand it, that's the most likely scenario.
Was it an old whale?
Yeah, I believe it was a fairly elderly mammal, yes.
Well, how do you know that?
Well, it'd have to be, wouldn't it? I mean, you're not going to die of old age unless you're getting on a bit, are you? Have a look in the dictionary.
Okay. But does this happen fairly often with whales?
Whales dying of old age?
Yeah.
In the areas where they do the seismic testing?
Yeah.
No, not a lot. And let me say, there was no seismic testing, as I understand it, being done in that area.
And who told you that?
The company who does the seismic testing.
The mining company?
I believe that's what they do, yeah.
Now, what is seismic testing exactly?
Seismic testing is an environmentally friendly and deeply sensitive way of firing an enormous sonic impulse into the ocean floor in order to see if there's anything down there.
And what happens if anything's in the way?
Well, there isn't anything in the way. There's just water down there. I mean, it's fired off a boat. You got the boat sitting on the top, and then below the boat, the blue area, that's the water.
I realise that. But is there anything in the water? I mean, fish and whales and things?
Oh, there are a few critters in there, but there's a fair bit of water between them. I don't know whether you've ever been fishing, for example. You'd be aware of this ratio. There are a fair bit more water than there are critters.
Yeah, exactly. But so there are creatures down there?
Well, no, not if you're going to fire a huge sonic impulse into the ocean floor. They get out of the area pretty briskly once the trouble starts. They're not idiots.
How do they communicate with each other?
Under the water?
Yeah.
Using sound. It's very clever. It's all sort of sonar.
How do they use sonar to communicate if the mining company's firing a sonic boom into the ocean floor?
Yes, it's a very good question. I'm afraid I don't know the answer. I'm not a botanist.
So this old whale that died, where is he now?
It's not there anymore.
still in the sea.
Well, nobody knows where it is. It's disappeared, apparently.
And who told you that?
The company that does the seismic testing.
Well, what were they doing out there?
They were just out there making sure that there was no seismic testing being done,
Why?
just in case anything went wrong.
Like what?
Well, if a whale's going to die of old age, for example, you wouldn't want it to happen during a seismic test.
No. Thanks for your time.
Bugger up your result, wouldn't it?
Sorry?
Sorry, just clearing the throat.
Okay, so the first half of that was a real report that came from Australia. The second half of that is a comedy team that just takes news and does satire about how ridiculous it is. But a lot of that actually holds true. The seismic companies are the ones we're going to for information. They're the ones reporting back to us exactly what's taking place out there. So I asked them at this meeting, I said, what happens if you get data? And they have all these acronyms. They have PEGs, they've got PBRs, which I'm a full-time bartender also in Florida, and a PBR means something totally different to me. And they've got takes, and a take is actually contact with an animal that makes it change its pattern. So they said, if one goes this direction when it was going that direction, that's considered a low-level take. We've altered it. And again, how do you know it went that way? With sonar. The whole thing is just ludicrous. But they're the ones who are giving us the information on what's going on. So I asked them directly. I said, obviously, worst case scenario, you do some blasting, a northern right whale, which is only less than 500 left, and you can see them from our beach in my hometown cresting. They breed in our area. One of these things gets hit during a seismic blast, it floats to the surface, they do a necropsy, it's damaged on the inside, its eardrums are blown, you guys killed it. He said, that would obviously stop it then, yeah, not necessarily. I said, wait a minute, you said if you kill a whale, you're going to continue blasting. And he said, well, there's numbers for that. There's mitigation. And he actually referenced the Japanese whaling fleet in the Antarctic, saying that there's still ways that we can take whale. Because I asked him about the international whaling regulations. He said there's actually rules that we can do that. I called BOEM to verify that, thinking maybe this guy had bad information in Louisiana. He got back to me and he said, actually, if we did kill a whale, or they killed a whale, it would stop. But that one boat would stop for a certain amount of time and the rest of it would probably continue. So this obviously can't happen. So what I'm begging you to do, my community is begging us to do, all of us who live on, anybody who loves the ocean is begging you to do, is please reach out. You know, social media is fantastic. Get on there tomorrow. Make this a priority. Tell your friends. I mean, this is a real thing. This could actually happen. It's not just oil exploration. It's the actual testing and looking for oil itself. This has got to stop. And my community and me personally, I'm begging you to help us stop this. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, and I am keenly aware that I am what stands between you and lunch. So I hope that that what I have for you today is compelling and interesting, but I'll try to speed through it in the interest of your growling stomachs. So I'm Stephanie McClellan. I am the director of the Special Initiative on Offshore Wind. We are a non-commercial philanthropy-funded catalyst to advance offshore wind, housed at the University of Delaware. And so I am here, I think, to present the alternative vision. So when we talk about offshore energy resources, what about that offshore wind resource? How are we going to tackle it? How are we going to achieve it? What are the obstacles? What's the potential? So this may be something that that you've seen before, and I don't know how educated you all are on offshore wind, so this is a little bit of an offshore wind 101. But you know, I think when you think about offshore wind, you can think of it that it is a uniquely abundant resource, and it is the largest and really the only renewable resource that Atlantic coast states have available to meet their renewable energy portfolio standards and to really bring clean energy in a very large scale way. Very limited land-based wind resources on the Atlantic coast, but then also it is so densely populated that it's very hard to deploy that. Solar, of course, is available, but when you talk about the amount of offshore wind on the Atlantic coast, it dwarfs really the amount that we could put on rooftops in the Atlantic coast. And of course, 60% of all Americans live on a coastal county. So we're really talking about a resource that is very, very well matched to load. And so I'm going to be talking really only about the Atlantic coast. And as on this slide shows, we're talking about 1,300 gigawatts. That's kind of the raw number of offshore wind when you think about the wind speeds that are out there. But it's, as you can see, it's really, it rivals what we talk about as kind of our major land-based wind that we have in the Midwest. And it's often referred to, the Atlantic coast is often referred to as the Saudi Arabia of offshore wind. But it's important to really think about how much of that resource can actually be developed. And so some colleagues of mine at the University of Delaware who've been working on wind resource assessments on offshore wind have really taken a look at kind of what really are the major exclusions, how might we start to think about what is the, quote, developable resource, a much more important number to understand than the raw number. And so taking a look at everything from human conflicts and human uses to shipping lanes, commercial fishing, recreational fishing, fish habitats, bird flyways, you really start to kind of narrow down, and what this chart shows up here, this is the wind resource of the Mid-Atlantic Bight. And the Mid-Atlantic, from an ocean geography perspective, is different than what we think of it here. We're talking about from Massachusetts to Cape Hatteras. So that's the area that I'm talking about right now when I talk about this particular resource size. And we're, you know, sort of what we have here on the chart here is the M there is water depth in meters. And so you can see that closer to shore, the exclusions are greater. That's an exclusion factor up there. And, you know, as you get further away from shore, those exclusions become less and less, basically because of the human uses. But at the end of the day, what we end up with, and I'll point to the bottom line there that says 330, and that really is the bottom line. This is the number you can go and use on the Hill tomorrow. There's 330 developable gigawatts of offshore wind in the Mid-Atlantic Bight from Cape Hatteras to Massachusetts. Now, how does that compare to the actual load of this area? Okay, so that's what the bottom part of this chart is the end use. What is the load of the Mid-Atlantic Bight in terms of energy use? The electricity load, so again, we can't talk about, we're not going to use offshore wind, we're not going to use wind for heavy industrial, we're not going to use it for heavy trucking, we're not going to use it for aviation. When we talk about electricity load, the end-use electricity load in the same area is 73 gigawatts. 73 gigawatts versus 330 gigawatts. Then, if we started to actually move towards electric vehicles, like many of us are hoping that we'll end up doing, and we get off of the need for petroleum for the light vehicle fleet on the Atlantic coast, that would be another 35 gigawatts to electrify the entire vehicle fleet from Massachusetts to North Carolina. So 108 gigawatts end use for our entire electricity load, as well as electrifying our fleet. We've got 330 gigawatts of developable resource. I do also just want to point out that the majority of that, so if you look at the first two lines, 0 to 20 and 20 to 50, up there in the first bars there, that is deployable today. That's not depending on future technology. That's not in deep water. That is technology today that is becoming more and more cost effective, much more attainable for us to start deploying now. So we have the opportunity to truly outstrip our electricity uses with offshore wind. Oh, what happened? I'm gonna, Ian. It's almost lunchtime. Yeah. I don't know what I did. Okay. So a couple of other things that I think are really important about offshore wind is its unique value proposition. And this chart is just really, you know, people talk about, well, what happens when the wind's not blowing? A wind blows at night. Land-based wind blows at night. Offshore wind generates on peak. And so what this chart is just showing is the top curve, is the electricity demand. And as you can see, offshore wind, the red dotted line and the black dotted line, those are different measures of offshore wind speed and offshore wind farms. Just as that demand is picking up, so is offshore wind. Very, very different from land-based wind. And so what this has the opportunity to do is, because of the large resource, its generation on peak, it has the opportunity to really actually benefit customers. And this is a very counterintuitive point. People say, well, wait a minute, I thought offshore wind was really expensive. How are you saying it can actually lower prices? By bringing in large amounts of offshore wind, you can actually kick out of the stack the dirtiest and the most expensive sources of energy, lowering the cost of producing energy across the board, lowering wholesale prices. So we've done a lot of work, number of colleagues across up and down the East Coast, I should say, not across the country, really looking into this in terms of what the savings can be to consumers, to citizens, and to ratepayers in terms of bringing in this very, very unique, abundant resource. I'm not going to go over the slide. I'm just going to say it's a huge market opportunity. In 2014, 4.2 billion to 5.9 billion euros in terms of market opportunity. And there's a number of different job projections that go around that say we're going to create hundreds of thousands of jobs or millions of jobs through offshore wind. Just from the experience in Europe alone, what we know is that in a mature industry, you generate about 9 jobs per megawatt. So if we're talking about 300,000 megawatts, you can do the math. In very, very high periods of construction, it's about 18 jobs per megawatt, so it's double that. So huge opportunity for our coastal economies, and we can do this in an environmentally friendly way. I know that I'll leave the questions about acoustics to our acoustic expert here, but two points that I want to point out. There's been a tremendous amount of research that's been done in Denmark, where the earliest offshore wind farms have been built, and now in the UK, really looking at cumulative effects. But just the graph up here on or I shouldn't call it a graph, but it's really a model of bird avoidance of offshore wind farms. And so I don't mean to be trite, but they're not bird brains. They can figure out how to go around wind turbines, and they do figure out how to go around wind turbines. In terms of whale protection, I just want to point out a very, very collaborative industry and NGO-ENGO partnership that resulted just a year ago, about a year and a week ago, an agreement between the developer of what will be the first U.S. offshore wind farm that just started construction last week. That's the Block Island project off of the coast of Rhode Island. That developer, Deepwater Wind, signed an agreement with 3 environmental organizations, NWF, NRDC, and CLF, to agree to halt construction during the migration patterns of the right whale. So there are as well surveyors and people on boat, but understanding that that may not be good enough, just simply putting the moratorium on, we will not build during this period of time. The value proposition, great jobs, great resource, really the only resource that we're going to use for clean energy on the East Coast in a big way, generates on peak, it can benefit consumers, it can create jobs and really bolster coastal economies, and we can do this in an environmental way with a collaboration between industry partners that are committed to doing so and folks like yourselves. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thank you, Johnny and Michael as well. We have time for a few questions. If anybody has one, be happy to take them. Start over here.
And I'm really glad you spoke about some aspects of mitigation, because one of my biggest concerns is I'm kind of the person on the ground, as you can imagine, where all of the mitigation protocols and diplomacy and all the agreements come together and are actually applied. And as I write comments as an activist, on my other hat, I'm concerned that the mitigation is going to come out as the big answer to the seismic testing, and as studying bioacoustics, I think that would be really awful, because lately the mitigation is really the bureaucracy around the appearance of compliance versus actual compliance is astounding. In fact, in California, we've pushed the California Inspector General is looking into what seems like, and there's a reason I'm going on this, but a minor detail, but it's actually.
We're getting to the question.
I will, and it's there are these non-disclosure agreements that all the consultants have to sign. And they have become so overwhelming that people are not reporting like they want to. Biologists, I can tell you lots of stories, but suffice to say that their hands are tied from actually reporting to the agencies like they want to be, whether it's MMOs or consultants with wind, you know. So
I'm not sure that people in the back can hear, so could you just go to the question and let these guys address it?
As good as how it's applied, and I'm seeing it not applied at all, and I keep, this is my mantra. So I'm wondering if you're speaking to NOAA, to NIMS, if you are aware of the degree of this, how mitigation is not the ultimate solution.
I think a real clear
Thank
answer
you.
to this is that there's
you.
migratory
You have a
disruptions
mic,
that have been
Mike.
noticed at 175 kilometers. So 500-meter setback is actually very little to do with what actual types of disruptions happen. So I didn't speak loud enough. Okay, sorry. Yeah. There's migratory disruptions noticed at 175 kilometers in fin whales and sea whales in the Mediterranean. So the 500-meter setback for mitigation threshold for marine mammal observers is just kind of window dressing. So it's the bottom line. In terms of all the other kind of structural stuff you talk about, I'm sure that exists, but the mitigation we're talking about for seismic is kind of window dressing for what actually is happening out there.
And to address your question directly, I did ask that question when I called Louisiana, when I called the Ocean and Energy Research Center, and they did confirm that they did have some things that happened. I mean, in the Gulf of Mexico, I was naive to the Gulf side, but apparently I pictured it as being a Gulf, like a bay. I didn't realize actually how deep it was, and they had sperm whales that are actually out there. So I know they did a lot of oil exploration there, obviously, because there's a lot of rigs there. So I asked if during that process, if these mitigations existed, and they said they did. So I asked for a record of how many takes or how many contact they had and how they reacted to that. And I got a little bit of an email response back, and then I kind of stopped hearing from them. So I'll continue to look into that. But I think it's interesting if you go on, and I'm a big proponent of social media, and I should have covered that more, but the things that have changed now that haven't happened before, grassroots can be a lot faster electronically now. And there's still this kind of stigma about social media when you bring it up, especially in the political arena. I'm the only one really touching on it in my community. You can reach out and get me and I'll answer you, and it's on a public forum, which is great. A lot of people stay away from it because of sunshine laws and things like that. But I think that's the future. I think that the grassroots, instead of something you read or you saw on TV, you can actually share it with everybody. And if you've got 200 friends like my mom does, which I thought was funny last night that she has 200 friends, but if you got that, if each one of them, sorry mom, but if each one of them shows you something, and she actually got involved in a discussion. So I'll start a discussion. I used one of the graphics that this gentleman put up of all the things on the bottom of the ocean if they actually find oil. I'm learning something new every day. I had no idea there was that much noise that continues on. I was naive enough to believe, well, if they find it, they drill and then the noise stops. But it continues and there's actually more. So I created a meme out of his with, you know, the words on top of the picture thing for my mom. And to gain reaction, when I put on there that the U.S. government actually will allow them to kill whales, that's a big deal. So I put a beautiful picture of a right whale, and then on the big lettering, the U.S. government actually will allow us to kill whales off the Atlantic coast. And that's a true statement. And then underneath that, you can put all the information that supports that. Well, that creates discussion. So as just some advice, and I know it can get heated on social media, if you can answer with facts, and I do a lot of like actual, put in the bottom, put in the actual facts, and Oceana is great. And immediately they go, well, that's Oceana. You know, that's a group that has a dog in the fight, and they're an environmental group, but they're referencing NOAA's own and the BOEM's own data. So they're showing you the government is saying we actually are going to affect over 150,000 animals by doing this. We know it, and it's their data. And one thing that my mom said, and I'll finish up here, is that she actually commented on one of these discussions. Somebody was going on. I gave the science, and I continue to be very calm in these names and bleeding hearts and all this stuff. So she said, instead of having to have proof that this is not going to hurt whales and dolphins and sea creatures and then turtles, why don't the oil companies have to prove that they're not going to hurt them? So if you go on the oil companies' websites and you can find them, it's hard sometimes, but if you find and cut and paste around, they'll tell you, oh, we have people that are watching for that. And look in the details of that. The most humorous ones I found, I had, thankfully, some wackadoodle put this on there, that sperm whales are actually louder than seismic blasting. And that's true. They have the dB range, decibel range is a complicated issue. They can actually burst out loud sounds for a short period of time, very short period of time, that they can use for echolocation. Also, there's a theory to stun prey. They can actually stun animals slow enough down that they can eat them. So the dB levels are just about right. And I found some scientists that actually started his paper by writing, a marine biologist that specialized in cetacea and sound. I can't believe I'm actually, he didn't say it in so many words, but there's rumors going around that seismic testing is as loud as whales. Here's why whales are not out there killing each other and killing themselves with their own sound. And he lists all the different reasons why that doesn't happen. But yes, they do say there's mitigation. And the fact that they're saying that they're watching out and they're mitigating is them saying, we know what we're doing is wrong and it's a danger, which is a step right there. But following up and seeing how that mitigation is done, don't just stop there. Look at how it's done and also look what happens to the data once it's turned in. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Johnny. I have another question over here, sir.
Why can't they find another way to do this without
In order to penetrate down deep into the ocean seafloor and seabed, you have to have long wavelength, heavy energy. And so there's really not a lot more efficient way of doing that other than these impulses, that air gun impulses. That's pretty kind of the short answer of that.
And the sad thing that research will show as well is that they really don't think it's there. The experts who do oil exploration, they've looked before, and they have geological surveys that they've already done. And their estimate is maybe, I think I've heard a month, Oceana, is that about right? A month, 2 months of US usage of oil, and they're talking about exporting this oil. So the argument that we're being self-supportive and we're not relying on Gulf region for our energy and getting involved with, geopolitically, not a good argument, because there's not enough there to really sustain us, and they're talking about oil that they're gonna export. The jobs are not going to be there as well. They're going to bring people from outside. It's not local jobs. So all those arguments that people try to use is why it's a good idea to explore for oil really aren't that valid of an argument. And also the argument that they're going to find it and that it's going to be used and it's going to stay in the community is pretty much not true.
Okay, I think I have another question over here, sir.
I'm Sir Dean, Executive Director of Wild Coast in the American Bureau of California, right next to the Mexican border, California. Dr. McClellan, look, I get it. Wind power is important, but in California, what we see is consistently industry saying, offshore area is great for LNG. Offshore area now is great for agriculture, which is really cool. But right now, we haven't identified the areas that are great for conservation. So I guess I would caution you. I'm on the advisory board of the Fish and Wildlife Services joint venture for the southwestern desert, northern Mexico. And we're seeing a huge impact from solar panels on birds. I wouldn't trivialize the impact of potential wind energy on birds. I think it's a super big deal, and the regulatory infrastructure to manage the regulated side. Number two, we've got to work with conservationists and agencies to really make sure that we conserve those offshore areas that are blue wildernesses before we start saying they're great for giant cement infrastructure that will, essentially destroy the wilderness. So we get it. We need to figure it out. Don't like oil exploration. We've got areas in San Diego that are going to be that are targeted right next to the coast. We've got to figure this out. Do a better job of working with conservationists to make sure that blue wilderness is conserved first, and then we figure out what's next best. So thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to respond?
Well, I agree with everything that you said. I mean, this is not a debate about this. I think that, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, the program, alternative energy programs, I think that there's a very good infrastructure in place of working through the process of determining what's called a federally designated wind energy area. So we don't have kind of a free-for-all where developers can go and say, I want to build a wind farm here. There are designated areas. And honestly, I mean, offshore wind is the last use. We complain about it. It's sort of any place that you can put it that doesn't have another use. That's where these are designated. And I think going forward, there will be kind of a next generation of those wind energy areas, especially when we move out into deeper water. And I believe that those partnerships, there are good foundations for those partnerships. And I believe that they will continue. So I don't take it lightly, but I've seen the data and I've seen the partnerships, and I'm optimistic.
Okay, any other questions? I think I see one way in the back there.
I'm glad you brought that up, and I meant to talk about that. Oceana is a great source for that, because the permitting process that I saw was a flow chart that I couldn't comprehend at all. I mean, there's so many different arrows going in different directions, and I was going to recommend that if you want to do more information on that, that I would go to Oceana and let you guys have that one.
Thanks. So I don't have to say it myself, but it's a really good question. Thank you for asking. I hope everybody's wondering the same thing. What's happening right now in communities along the coast is nothing short of a revolution. Communities stepping up and saying, we don't want this, is what has to happen next. And what we're seeing is that not only when one community does it and the ones next to them start thinking about it, but they're getting bigger, and they're going to cities, and they're going to state capitals, and they're going to counties that are also passing resolutions. And now we're having members of Congress that formerly thought that they were maybe supportive of seismic testing saying, okay, no, I'm not actually. Well, and why I rethought it? Because all these communities told me to rethink it. That's what Mark Sanford said about why he rethought it. All the communities passing resolutions in his district. So now we're going to congressmen and senators. And so ultimately what we need to do is convince the governors. And we've actually heard not just my David Hayes story about the people don't want it, but we've actually heard from Secretary Jewell that it really comes down to what the governors want. And if you look, you can see that it kind of rings true. The governors in states that said they didn't want drilling didn't have drilling included in the 5-year plan. And so ultimately we have to convince the governors, and they're tough customers, but we can do it. If everybody else in the state is starting to say no, they will as well. And so that's really what we need to do, is to engage in your community, help other people in their communities, make it a priority for your organization if you work for a coastal organization. And please talk to the Oceana organizers in the room, and maybe you guys could raise your hands, and Randy and Nancy and Caroline and probably Aaron's here. I don't know if Samantha's here, but these are guys, their full-time job is to get resolutions passed and to get opposition built to stop the drill on the Atlantic coast. So talk to these guys and let them help you, help us, help you.
Wish me luck to my governor, by the way.
But I will say, actually, the Scott administration has come out and said, DEP now saying that they don't want to see seismic testing, at least anytime soon. So, wow, we got that, and that's
good. And Senator Bill Nelson also, the kudos to Senator Nelson, has also come out against it. And his big proponent, one of his major reasons was that the U.S. Navy doesn't want it. Kings Bay Naval Station is right north of us, and it's a big nuclear base. And like I alluded to before, background noise makes it very hard for us to detect submarines. It also makes it difficult for detection systems to warn of incoming submarines.
If you can get Rick Scott, you can win this. Yeah. So you guys, this is a winnable fight.
First, let's thank this panel. How many of you are going up on the Hill tomorrow? Okay, we should all be up there and tell them that no drilling, no seismic testing, and we're going to see them back in their districts, and we're going to make sure we're going to do the field campaign organizing. I mean, 5 years ago, I flew out of Alabama, and we flew over a large pod, like 100 dolphins and a humpback whale trapped and dying in that oil. I don't ever want to see anything like that again. None of us do. And we stopped in California, so 20 years later we can stop it here. But back then it was, energy versus marine pollution. Today it's a product liability issue. This product used directed, it's going to overheat your planet and acidify your oceans. So how many have gotten a good experience since Senator Whitehouse started talking? They just make a seal sound. That's. We got a tremendous afternoon. It's going to take a lot of protein, so we've got your lunch waiting for you, and thanks for your patience.
I'm just afraid I would forget it, but I didn't need to be in so much of a hurry. Stephanie has hers. Okay. That was perfect. That was perfect. Thank you so much. It was really great. Actually,
Absolutely, absolutely. As long as being progressive sounds, I'm appreciating. Oh, yeah.